The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, soft and cutting, the kind of cold that made folks turn their collars and mind their own business. Samuel Coleridge, a man with more dust than pride clinging to his boots, rode into Cold Creek not for trouble, but for a bag of grain and a part for his wagon wheel. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words all week, and he liked it that way. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't ask about the wife buried under the cottonwood tree or the mortgage stamped in red ink. But silence broke that day. Behind the saloon, where old crates and rusted spittoons lay forgotten, a small crowd had gathered like flies to rot. No music, no auction bell. Just murmurs, eyes flicking toward the alley then away again, as if seeing it might brand their souls with shame. He dismounted slow, tied his horse loose. Curiosity wasn't virtue, but something about the hush behind that saloon gripped him. And then he saw her. She wasn't crying. That would have been easier. Her dress was plain and patched, the hem muddied from travel. One hand rested over her swollen belly, the other hung limp. Blonde hair, tangled and wind-bitten, framed a face too pale for summer. A man stood beside her, bearded, mean-eyed, smelling of sour whiskey. Another leaned against a barrel, arms crossed, a twisted smile on his face. Brothers, Samuel would later learn. In-laws, to be precise. The kind that made a man wish the law bit harder. "Don't look like much," one of them muttered to a fat merchant with dirty fingernails. "But she's healthy enough. Child's near to term. Strong stock. Could be of use if you got hands need warming." Someone chuckled. Another spat. Samuel's jaw tightened. The girl didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just stared down at the cracked ground like she might vanish if she stared long enough. "That's enough," the merchant said. "I'm not talking no charity case with a mouth to feed. She ain't charity. She's kin. Husband passed, left debts. We're settin' things right." Someone muttered, "Ain't no preacher at this auction." Samuel took a slow step forward. One of the in-laws turned. "You lookin' to buy, stranger?" he sneered. The girl lifted her eyes then. Briefly. Just once. They locked with Samuel's. Not pleading. Not broken. But hollow. The kind of hollow you get when the world keeps taking and never says sorry. "No," Samuel said. "Just lookin'. But he wasn't. There were stories in the girl's silence. Rage, shame, quiet defiance. Something twisted in his chest. He'd buried a child once. Just one. Born too early. Buried beside his wife the next week. That wound never healed. But somehow this girl's silence brushed right up against it. The bearded man laughed. "Don't worry. She ain't got the strength to protest. Never did. Always soft-spoken. Makes it easier." The girl's lips moved. No sound came. But she blinked like a storm was behind her eyes. "Where's the sheriff?" someone whispered. "Probably paid not to see." Samuel felt heat rise in him. Not the kind that made fists fly. The colder kind. Like frostbite working up from the bones. He stepped closer. "How much you want?" The merchant and both in-laws turned. The girl did not. Bearded one squinted. "You serious?" Samuel nodded. A long silence. $50, the man spat. "And a rifle. If you got one." Samuel reached into his coat. Tossed a leather pouch. Then slowly unhooked the old Winchester from his back. "You're a damn fool," someone muttered. The bearded man snatched the rifle like it was candy. Coins were counted without ceremony. "She's yours." Samuel didn't move. "What's her name?" "Does it matter?" He looked at her. She looked back. "Yes." The girl's voice came, small and cracked. "Eleanor Dumont." It broke something open in him. A name. A voice. That's all it took to turn her from object to person. He offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she stepped toward him. That was enough. They walked through town like ghosts. The sun dipped low. No one stopped them. A few eyes lingered, but most turned away. Guilt makes cowards of decent men. He helped her into the wagon. Still no tears. Still no questions. She sat with her hands folded over her belly, staring ahead like a woman sentenced to something she didn't understand. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Cold Creek. Dust rose in swirls behind them. They didn't speak for a long while. Finally, Samuel said, "You don't owe me nothin'. You understand?" She didn't answer. But she turned to look at him. Just for a second. Then forward again. The sky grew purple. Stars blinked through like shy children. They stopped for the night in a hollow near the riverbed. He built a small fire. Gave her his coat. She took it but didn't speak. He offered jerky and cornbread. She ate without tasting. "I ain't a man who saves people," he muttered. "Just Didn't want to leave you there. Still silence. The fire cracked and danced. She finally spoke. Quiet, raw. They weren't always cruel. He didn't answer. Some truths didn't need echoing. They said I was a burden, she said. Too much to feed. Said my husband's death made me worthless. Samuel stared into the flames. They were wrong. She looked at him. Then back to the fire. I don't know where we're going, she whispered. Neither do I. The baby kicked. She flinched. He noticed. You all right? She nodded once. Then asked, why'd you do it? Samuel hesitated. Then, because I saw my wife's eyes in yours. Eleanor Dumont blinked. The firelight shimmered on her cheek. He rolled out a blanket for her. Took the hard ground himself. They didn't speak again that night. But something shifted. A brittle warmth beneath the cold. As Samuel stared up at the stars, he wondered, not for the first time, if redemption came quietly. Not through grand gestures. But through one broken soul reaching for another. And in that still night, with fire low and frost creeping near, Eleanor Dumont turned toward him in the dark and whispered, Thank you. He didn't answer. Just closed his eyes. Because maybe that was the beginning. And tomorrow he knew would ask everything from both of them. The morning came heavy with fog. Not the light, drifting kind, but thick as wool, wrapping the world in a breathless hush. Samuel woke before dawn as he always did. Years on the land had trained him to rise with the cold. But today he lingered a moment longer, watching the still shape on the blanket beside the embers. Eleanor Dumont hadn't moved much through the night. Curled inward, both arms wrapped around her middle like she feared something might be taken from her in the dark. Her breathing was shallow, steady, like a woman who had learned not to make noise, even in sleep. He stood, brushed the frost from his coat, and set to making coffee. Quiet, deliberate motions. The way he used to move around wild animals. By the time she opened her eyes, steam curled from the pot and the fire had grown to a soft amber glow. She didn't speak. Just sat up slowly, one hand steadying herself, the other cupping her belly. Coffee? He asked. She nodded once. He poured her a tin cup. She took it with both hands, sipping slow, the metal rattling against her lip. I figure we can reach the ranch by sundown, he said. It ain't fancy but it's dry. Got a bed. Stove works fine when she's fed right. Still no words. But he didn't push. After all, silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was armor. They rode in quiet. The wheels groaned beneath them. The mule snorted now and then, swishing its tail against imagined flies. Trees crept by like ghosts in the mist, their trunks thin and wet as old bones. She asked nothing. Not about the ranch. Not about him. Not even where he came from. So he told her anyway. I was raised in Kansas, he said. Dustier than here. Meaner too. My father was a preacher. My mother died birthing my sister. She didn't last past 6 winters. No response. Just the rhythm of hooves. I left at 16. Thought I'd find gold. Found cattle instead. He glanced at her. Still she said nothing. But her fingers clenched slightly in her lap. My wife Miriam was better than I ever deserved. She had freckles like cinnamon. Could outshoot me with a rifle and outbake any woman in the county. We lost our first child in the spring frost. She passed 2 months later. A breath escaped him, half memory, half wound. Eleanor Dumont turned her head just slightly toward him. Then forward again. But something in her shoulders softened. When they reached the ranch, the fog had lifted. Sunlight cut across the land in gold ribbons, making the frost sparkle like it had secrets to keep. The house stood plain and weathered, 2 windows missing shutters, porch slanted. But it held the air of something honest. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her longer than needed. She moved slow but steady, each step cautious. Let me show you inside. She followed him through the creaking door. The interior was spare, wooden walls, simple table, 2 chairs, iron stove, and a room off to the side with a bed barely large enough for one. His wife's quilt still lay across it. She paused in the doorway. Reached out. Ran her hand along the edge of the patchwork like it might bite her. I can take the barn tonight, he offered. You rest. Her voice was barely there. No. I'm not helpless. He nodded, not sure what to say to that. So he said nothing. She settled slowly onto the bed, boots still on, back upright. He returned with a basin of warm water and left it beside her without a word. Outside, he chopped wood until his arms burned. Not because the stove needed it, but because silence sometimes roared louder than screams. By nightfall, she had washed and folded the quilt down. Her hair was damp, her face a little less pale. But her eyes, those stayed guarded. Supper was bread, beans, and dried apples. She ate slow, mechanically, like someone who hadn't tasted food in months but had forgotten how to savor. As they sat across the table, he finally said, "You're safe here." She didn't meet his eyes. "Safe don't mean not scared," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I know." A long pause stretched between them. Then, softly, "His name was Daniel. My husband. He wasn't cruel. Just tired. Died of fever after the child quickened." Samuel listened, hands still. "His family said I owed them. That I'd brought the sickness. That I'd eaten more than I worked. They told me to leave, but not before making sure I was taken care of." Her voice broke slightly on that last part. "I'm sorry," he said. "They called me a burden," she continued. "Said I'd cursed them." He looked at her hands, thin, rough, trembling faintly. "You're not a burden," he said. She looked up then sharply as if the words slapped her. "You don't know me. Don't need to." Silence. "Then, you still gonna make me your wife?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only if you ask me to." Her breath caught. "I won't ask," she said after a long pause. "Then I won't push." They sat in that stillness, both holding their scars like keepsakes. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. She swept the floor, cooked what she could. Sometimes she sat on the porch and stared at nothing for hours. Other times she helped feed the mule, her hand brushing its nose like she was remembering softness. He kept his distance. Let her own the silence. Then one evening, while he mended a fence near the paddock, she came out with a steaming cup. "Coffee," she said, holding it out. He blinked. Took it carefully. "Thank you." She didn't reply. But she stood there close. Not touching. Just near enough that he felt her presence in his ribs. "I used to hum," she said quietly. "When I was a girl. I haven't in a long time. Maybe you will again." She didn't answer. But the next morning, as she folded laundry on the porch, he heard the faintest sound, barely there. A note. Maybe two. A hum, broken but brave. He didn't look up. Just kept whittling the wood in his hands. That night, rain came heavy. Thunder rolled far off. He lit the lantern and sat by the stove. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He set down the knife. "I think they believe in us," he said. She nodded. Stepped into the light. "You've been kind," she said. "But I'm still afraid." "So am I. I don't want to be owned." "You're not." "I don't want to be saved." "Then just stay." The silence between them turned warm for once. She walked over, sat across from him. The lantern flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow. Her voice was stronger now. "I don't know how to be loved." "You don't have to." She blinked. "You just have to sit here," he said, "and not run." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached across the table. Not for his hand, but to place her palm flat beside his. A nearness. A beginning. Outside the wind howled. But inside, something fragile and sacred held still. And in that quiet moment, as thunder echoed in the hills, Samuel realized. She wasn't wrapped in silence anymore. She was unfolding. Spring came early that year. The snow that clung to fence posts melted into the thirsty earth, and the ground cracked open like it had something to say. Buds swelled on trees that hadn't dared bloom in seasons. And on the porch of a weathered ranch house just outside Cold Creek, a woman stood barefoot in the early sun, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the porch rail. She didn't smile. But she breathed deeper. Samuel watched from the field, one boot in the stirrup, as the mule shifted under his weight. The sight of her standing there, quiet, real, still learning how to take up space again, did something to him he couldn't name. Eleanor Dumont had begun rising before him some mornings, making coffee and setting the table with deliberate care. She didn't talk much, but the silence between them had softened. It wasn't fear anymore. It was soil. And something had started growing. She asked to help him mend the barn roof. He said no. She insisted. He handed her nails, showed her how to set them. Her hands were slow but certain. When she slipped on the shingles and let out a gasp, he caught her. Just a touch, his hand at her back, her palm flat on his chest. For a moment, neither moved. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks flushed. But the heat wasn't from fear. In the evenings, she sat on the porch sewing baby clothes from old curtains and worn flannel shirts. Her fingers moved like memory, thread, needle, breath. She'd never had much, but she wanted something soft waiting when the child arrived. Samuel built a cradle in the shed. Worked on it at night by lantern light, shaping the wood slow and clean. When she found it one morning she didn't say a word. Just ran her hand along the curve of the frame and left a jar of jam by his coffee cup. In town rumors had begun to change shape. At first, he bought her at auction. Then she don't talk much. Must be simple. But lately, he's building her a porch swing. She's teaching his mule to bow its head for sugar. People talked. People always did. But Eleanor Dumont held her chin a little higher now. And Samuel never answered back. He'd never had use for town opinions before, and he wasn't about to start now. One afternoon she asked to go with him to the general store. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I want to see something besides these four walls." She wore her late husband's hat low, her old dress tight across her belly. Her boots didn't match. But she walked into that store like a woman who remembered who she was. Mrs. Dellinger, the storekeeper's wife, raised a brow. "You look well, dear." Eleanor Dumont's voice didn't waver. "I feel well." They bought flour, beans, and a bit of blue ribbon. When Samuel asked about the ribbon, she said nothing. But later at home, she tied it around her braid and looked at herself in the window. For the first time she saw something worth looking at. That night, under the oil lamp's hum, Samuel brought out an old record box. Not music. Letters. Recipes. The burnt-edge photo of his late wife. She was beautiful, Eleanor Dumont said, holding the picture carefully. "She was," he said. Silence. Then, "and kind?" "The kindest." Eleanor Dumont traced the edge of the photo. "I'm not her." "No," he said. "You're not." She looked up, bracing. "But you're here." Her eyes welled. But no tears fell. Instead she said, "I want to plant tomatoes." He blinked. "Next to the fence," she added. "And lavender. I remember the smell from when I was little. We'll get seeds this week." "Good." He watched her carefully. Something was shifting. Not just in her but around her. As if the house had exhaled. As if the land knew it had another woman to care for now. And then came the knock. It was late. Too late for neighbors. Samuel stood from the table, reached for the rifle hanging near the door. Eleanor Dumont froze. The knock came again. When he opened the door, 3 men stood outside. One had a wide hat and narrow eyes. Another chewed tobacco like it was his only skill. The third he recognized. Eleanor Dumont's brother-in-law. "Evenin', Coleridge," the man said with a crooked smile. Samuel didn't return it. "You're not welcome here. We just come to check on Kin." "She's not yours to check on. She's carrying blood," the man said, stepping forward. "Family blood." Eleanor Dumont appeared behind Samuel, one hand resting on the doorframe. "She told you no," Samuel said. "That ought to be enough." "Easy there," the man grinned. "Ain't here to fight. Just talk. Maybe take her home." "She is home." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think buying her changes that?" Eleanor Dumont's voice came clear and strong. "You're not taking me." Samuel glanced at her. Her face was pale but her jaw was set. The brother-in-law spit in the dirt. "You think you'll raise that child without our name? Without what's owed? You gave up rights when you sold me," she said. "I'm not your debt." He laughed, but it was bitter. "This ain't over." Samuel shut the door in their faces. Eleanor Dumont didn't tremble. Not then. But later, when she sat on the porch in the dark, he heard her breath catch. He stepped outside, blanket over one arm. "You knew they'd come," she whispered. He sat beside her. "I figured. They want the child. They can want all they like." Pause. Wind stirred the trees. "I'm scared," she said. "So am I." She turned to him. Her face was bare, open. "I don't want to run again." "You won't." She looked at him then. For a long time. And in that look, something passed between them, like hands touching without touching. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Maybe I will ask." "Ask what?" She looked away but smiled just barely. "To be your wife." Samuel said nothing. Just reached over and took her hand. Held it. Let the warmth of that single gesture speak louder than any vow. Inside, the fire crackled low. And outside, the seed she'd asked to plant waited beneath the thawed ground, ready like her to begin again. Eleanor Dumont woke with a weight pressing on her chest, not from the child she carried but from the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that came before a storm. The birds had not yet started their morning song. The wind outside moved in low sighs. Something had shifted in the air, though she couldn't say what. She pressed her hand against her belly and waited. Samuel was already outside, splitting wood by the barn. She could hear the measured rhythm of his axe, each strike a steady beat in the song of their days. Reliable. Familiar. Safe. But safety, Eleanor Dumont had learned, was often an illusion, a blanket too thin to cover what waited beneath. She stepped outside into the golden light, wrapped in her shawl, her braid loose down her back. Samuel saw her and lowered his axe. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded but didn't smile. Something's wrong. He didn't question her. He'd come to trust her instincts like he trusted the seasons. Unpredictable but rarely mistaken. By noon the wind had picked up. Dust danced across the hills and the mule paced near the fence. Eleanor Dumont stayed close to the house, eyes scanning the horizon. When the riders came, they came slow. Deliberate. 3 of them again, same men as before but this time armed and less courteous. The brother-in-law led, face smug beneath his hat. Samuel stepped down from the porch, rifle across his back, jaw tight. Eleanor Dumont stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach, the other on the frame. "Afternoon," the man said, spitting to the side. "We come for what's ours." Samuel didn't move. "You came for trouble. You signed nothing. Ain't no preacher tied you to. She's still legally ours and that baby's kin." "She's not yours," Samuel said, his voice low. "She never was." The man dismounted, slow, drawing a folded paper from his coat. "Got a signature here," he said, waving it. "Her late husband owed us half the homestead. Since he's gone and she's carrying his heir, we figure we're owed what's left." "You'll get nothing," Eleanor Dumont said from the doorway, her voice cold as iron. He turned toward her. "You think this man can protect you? He's got nothing. You think this shack and his silence make you safe?" "I don't think," she replied. "I know." He stepped toward the porch. Samuel raised the rifle. "That's far enough." The man stopped. "You gonna shoot your wife's family?" he sneered. Samuel didn't blink. "If I have to." The man laughed, backing off. "You think this ends here? You think a paper won't find its way to the court in Cold Creek?" "Go ahead," Samuel said. "Bring the law. But you'll lose. 'Cause I married her, yesterday morning." Pastor Evans signed the record. Witnessed by his wife and the town clerk. The man froze. "You're lying." "Go check." Eleanor Dumont stepped down beside Samuel. She took his hand, right there in front of the men who once sold her. "I chose him," she said. "That's what you never understood. You can't sell someone who doesn't belong to you." The man's eyes burned. But he knew he'd lost. Not just in law but in presence. Still he left a warning. "You'll regret this. One day when the child's sick or hungry or looking for a name, and you got nothing left to give." Eleanor Dumont held her head high. "Then I'll give them this story. Of how we stood our ground." He turned and rode off without another word. The others followed. Silence returned to the homestead, but it was heavier now, like a rope pulled too tight. Samuel set the rifle aside, shoulders dropping. "You really went into town and married me?" Eleanor Dumont asked, teasing a little edge into her voice. "I did," he said. "Didn't want to presume. Figured you'd say no. I was planning to ask you today." He looked at her. "Well, beat you to it." She smiled then. A real one. Not wide but warm and unguarded. That evening the wind calmed. The sun dipped low, spilling orange across the earth. They sat on the porch swing he'd finally finished, her head resting against his shoulder. Inside the cradle waited. Beside it, a stitched name, her own, embroidered into a small quilt. Eleanor Dumont stared out across the prairie, then whispered, "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe. But they won't get through me. I believe that." Pause. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "You're not safe," he replied. "Not in this world. But you're not alone." She closed her eyes. That night, she lay in his bed without fear. No promises spoken, but a quiet vow lived in the spaces between them. Outside, the ground shifted again, spring digging in, stubborn and slow. And within her, a different seed turned toward the light. The fire came at night. Not a thunderclap blaze, but a slow, crawling beast that crept from the edge of the fields and found breath in the dry hay. By the time Samuel smelled the smoke, it was already too late for the barn. He bolted from the bed, shotgun in one hand, pulling on boots with the other. Eleanor Dumont followed, robe dragging behind her, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other cradling the child still beneath her ribs. The flames had reached high into the rafters. Sparks flew like angry stars. The mule cried from its tether, wild-eyed, desperate. Samuel ran in, coat over his head, teeth clenched against the heat. He cut the rope, slapped the animal's flank and stumbled back, coughing, eyes watering. The barn groaned. A beam crashed behind him. Eleanor Dumont shouted his name, her voice a sharp thing in the night air. He staggered toward her, smoke curling from his shoulders, and she caught him halfway to the porch, pulling him back like a tethered soul from hell. Neighbors saw the fire. They came with buckets, blankets, and rough, weary hands. Mrs. Dellinger brought bread. The young storekeeper ran barefoot carrying a jug of water. Someone, Samuel didn't know who, said they'd seen a rider leave the property not long before the blaze. But no one spoke the name. No one needed to. Samuel didn't curse. He didn't shout. He watched the barn collapse in on itself like a prayer unanswered, then turned and walked back to the porch. Eleanor Dumont followed, hand tucked in his. The next morning, smoke still drifted in gray threads across the sky. Ash clung to the windows. The cradle inside the house had been untouched. So had the quilt. Eleanor Dumont sat at the table, a shawl wrapped tight around her. Her eyes were steady, her voice quiet. "They want to break us," she said. Samuel poured water into a tin cup, set it before her. "They won't," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you." He reached across the table, took her hand gently. His calluses had softened a little in the months since she'd come. Or maybe hers had matched his. Later that week, Eleanor Dumont went into labor. It came sudden in the blue hush before dawn, with the wind howling low and fierce across the plains. Samuel didn't panic. He gathered water, boiled cloth, called for the neighbor woman who'd delivered 3 of her own. Eleanor Dumont gritted her teeth and gripped the bedpost until her knuckles bled white. The pain was long. Bro. But when the baby's first cry filled the room, it was louder than the fire had been. A boy, dark-haired, soft-lunged, furious at being born into such a world. Eleanor Dumont wept, cradling him to her chest. Samuel didn't cry. But he stepped outside, stared at the rising sun, and whispered his wife's name into the wind, not Miriam but Eleanor Dumont. She was his wife now, and this was their world. The weeks after were quiet but not still. They rebuilt the barn with the help of neighbors who no longer whispered behind hands. Eleanor Dumont planted tomatoes along the fence and lavender beneath the window. The baby's laughter came soft and slow, but when it came, it lit the house like a second sunrise. One day Samuel found her sitting in the dirt, baby in her arms, ribbon in her hair, smile tucked into the corner of her mouth like a secret she no longer had to keep. "I thought I'd die out here," she said. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I lived." And Samuel, who had buried one family, realized he'd grown another. Not through blood but through choice. Through fire. Through silence that had become speech and wounds that had become roots. That fall they held a second wedding, this time with neighbors present, and rings traded beneath the cottonwood where his first wife lay. Eleanor Dumont placed a small flower on the grave, not for jealousy, but for gratitude. At supper, Mrs. Dellinger raised a glass and said, "May the child carry both their names." He did. In town no one questioned them anymore. They were a unit. A man who spoke little but protected much. A woman once sold, now seen. And a child born in the middle of both their storms. Sometimes, on still nights, Eleanor Dumont would sit on the porch and hum. And Samuel, rocking the baby in his arms, would close his eyes, not to rest but to remember how it all began. With a whisper behind a saloon. With a silence that needed no saving. And with a man who didn't ask for love, but waited long enough to earn it. Let them write history in books about the wars and outlaws. This one would be written in soil and ash and soft blue ribbon. And for those who ever doubted whether broken things bloom, Eleanor Dumont had her answer. She lived it. And in that wind-swept prairie, under skies that knew sorrow and sun, a woman once auctioned now sat as a matriarch, head high, heart full. Because love on the frontier wasn't built in ballads. It was carved with patience, lit by fire, and kept alive by those brave enough to stay.
I stood at the edge of the dance floor, my fingers tightening around a champagne glass like it was the only thing holding me together. The crystal lights from the Ritz-Carlton ballroom ceiling glinted off the emerald satin dress I wore, making me look every bit the perfect wife to anyone watching. But inside, I was breaking. Right in front of me, my husband, Richard Donovan, was spinning a blonde woman in a tango so seductive it sent a chill down my spine. The woman was Claire Monroe, the youngest associate at Richard's law firm Donovan and Healy. Just last week he said she was just a promising employee. Now that promise had her chest pressed against him. her lips grazing his cheek with every turn. I used to love his dancing, the confident steps, the firm grip. It all used to make me feel chosen. 12 years ago, I was a senior architecture student when those eyes melted me, and now, those same eyes lost in someone else, were the only thing keeping me grounded. They make a beautiful couple, a voice sliced in beside me. Evelyn, wife of Richard's longtime partner. A woman who always knew the exact moment to strike. I turned and offered a thin smile. Claire seems very committed to advancing her professional relationships. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to explode. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I simply raised my glass, clinked it lightly against her martini, then turned away, as if I hadn't just watched my husband slide his hand down another woman's back. I slipped quietly out of the ballroom and into the marble-tiled powder room. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman with a high bun, dark red lips, and eyes that no longer sparkled. She was gone long ago. I used to dream, used to design homes filled with freedom. Now, I lived in a picture-perfect one, where everything looked right, except the marriage. I opened my purse. A message blinked on the screen. Cars ready, rear exit, lot 3, J. Jason, my best friend for 20 years, the only one who knew I'd been planning this moment for 6 months. He always said, "Grace, you don't need a scene to reclaim your freedom. You just need the right moment to leave." I took a deep breath, adjusted my pearl earrings, and stepped out. The orchestra had shifted to a slower tune. Richard and Claire were still on the floor. The world around them vanished. Perfect. I moved through the crowd, standing where Richard couldn't possibly miss me. And then he saw me. His gaze wavered for a second. Claire turned too, and for a moment I saw more than victory in her eyes. I saw doubt. "Grace," Richard stammered, trying to create distance between them. "Claire and I were just discussing legal strategy, right?" I cut in, my voice soft. "Very passionate. Carry on." I calmly placed my champagne glass on a nearby table. Then, from my purse, I pulled out something small. The platinum wedding band he gave me on our 5-year anniversary. No farewell words, no tears. I laid the ring on the glass tabletop. The sound was strangely soft, yet sharp, like the first crack in a perfect mask. "Keep dancing with her, Richard," I whispered, "because you won't notice when I disappear." I turned, walking away with the music in my wake. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because I knew, by the time Richard realized what he'd lost, I'd be somewhere he could never reach. A gray Lincoln waited at lot 3, engine idling. Jason sat behind the wheel, lit by the glow of his phone as I opened the door. His eyes met mine, no questions asked. He just nodded, like confirming that the plan was in motion and that from this moment on, I was no longer Grace Donovan, wife of prominent attorney Richard Donovan. "You bring the old phone?" Jason asked as I got in. I handed him the iPhone Richard used to track my schedule, calls, even photos. "Powered off, location still on." Jason smiled. "Perfect." He tossed it into a black bag with a few other devices I'd been prepping for weeks. When that bag went into the Hudson River tomorrow morning, any trace of me would vanish with it. I stared out the window. The city still sparkled, still pulsed, still cold, as if no one cared a woman had just left behind 12 years of marriage. But I didn't need the city's sympathy. I needed a beginning no one could trace. "You sure about this?" Jason asked, turning onto the highway away from Manhattan. "More than ever," I said, gripping my bag. Inside, a new ID, an unactivated phone, and a folder Jason helped me prepare for months. My new name was Nora Whitman, born 1985 in Madison, Wisconsin, degree in strategic management, background in operations consulting for mid-sized firms, real enough to pass checks, vague enough to avoid scrutiny. When I first brought up the idea of disappearing, Jason had stayed silent a long time. We once dated sophomore year, but time, distance, and choices split us. I married Richard. Jason went into cybersecurity, stayed single, always said love was a luxury in a world full of data breaches. But when I said I wanted to vanish, he said just one thing. "If you're going to do it right." And he didn't just help me. He taught me how to vanish. We opened a Belize bank account under my new name, moved money in small transfers from a personal account Richard never checked. I sold part of my design studio stake through a legal entity Jason set up, funneled the money into a Singapore business account, We hired an independent financial expert to diversify the assets, everything under Nora Whitman. We also hired a discreet attorney, an old contact of Jason's from Witness Protection, to legalize all ID changes, asset transfers, even the new passport. Medical card, social security, Portland residency papers, they're all in your suitcase, Jason said as we turned into a remote guest lodge. You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow my sister's contact will get you to the airport. I'm not flying straight to Portland? No, you'll stop in Denver, change names again. Nora Whitman is just a bridge. I nodded, all part of the plan. When we parked, Jason handed me a new phone. No GPS, no social apps. Only use this to call me if it's urgent. From now on, you're Nora. No turning back. I looked at him for a long time. Those eyes, unchanged after all these years, held something Richard never did. Absolute trust. Thank you, Jason, for everything. He nodded, silent. I knew helping me wasn't just about protecting someone he once loved. It was his way of redeeming what we lost years ago. I entered the room, opened my suitcase and sat by the simple bed. On the wooden table I placed the Nora Whitman ID beside the only photo I brought. My mother, who used to say, "You can be anyone, as long as you choose the right time to begin." I had chosen the right time, and tonight was the beginning. The next morning I sat in the quiet room as sunlight filtered through the curtains, dust floating like a faint stage curtain in the air. I opened the encrypted laptop Jason had prepped, used only for accessing finances, secured data, and evidence. What I was about to open was a file that had cost me many sleepless nights. A collection of documents gathered during the final 2 months before I disappeared, while Richard still believed I was busy designing a boutique hotel in Asheville. It all started when I came across a letter from the bank buried in a pile of unopened mail on the desk at home. Normally Richard handled all the financial paperwork. I never had a reason to question anything. But this letter, titled Notice of Secondary Mortgage Loan, was addressed to me as a co-owner of the house. I remembered clearly, the $1,800,000 0 home in Fulton County had been fully paid off by the 3rd year of our marriage, mostly using the inheritance I received from my grandfather after he passed away. And yet, Richard had taken out a $650,000 0 loan against that very house 6 months ago, without saying a word. I felt like the floor had just vanished beneath me. I called Jason, nearly in a state of panic. He came over within an hour, bringing data recovery tools and remote email retrieval software. "I think I can help you find something on Richard's laptop," Jason said as he plugged a USB drive into the silver MacBook Richard always took on business trips. "But Grace, if you decide to dig deep, you need to be ready. Not everything you find is going to be something you want to know." I nodded. The truth, even if painful, is better than staying naive. Within 20 minutes, we found files hidden in a folder with simple but sophisticated encryption. Inside were detailed spreadsheets of investments Richard had secretly made under a shell company, Donovan Strategic Holdings. Not a single entry involved joint assets. No reports had ever been shared with me. And worse, the money from the mortgage loan had been split and transferred into 3 private investment accounts in Miami, one of which listed a co-owner, Claire Monroe. "Claire!" I whispered. That name cut deep. It was no longer suspicion, no longer theory. It was solid proof that Richard hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had, financially, conspired with another woman behind my back. Jason didn't say anything, just watched me. I knew he was waiting for a reaction. But I didn't cry. I just felt cold, not from the weather, but from being erased from my own life. I started collecting everything: bank statements, emails, a copy of the mortgage agreement, footage from the security camera at the penthouse Richard rented in Savannah, a place I had never been invited to but Claire had visited at least 10 times in the past 3 months. There was even a receipt for a sapphire jewelry set worth nearly $20,000, 0 cents from a boutique jeweler. An exact match to what Claire wore at the firm's end-of-quarter party. The most painful? A hotel reservation receipt from the Four Seasons in Chicago, the same night I stayed home hosting a birthday dinner for his mother. I quietly saved every file, locked them with passwords and uploaded them to a secure cloud system Jason had set up. "If you don't log in within 72 hours, Jason said, All this data will automatically be sent to Richard's law partners, the Georgia State Bar, and a financial investigative journalist I know. I nodded again, no words were needed. In that moment I understood. Richard hadn't just planned for a life without me. He'd been building it quietly for over a year, using my money, my effort, and my trust. If I hadn't uncovered it, one day he would have walked away from the marriage as the victor, and I'd be left with the shattered remains of a life wiped clean. But now everything had changed. I didn't need to confront Richard. I just needed to disappear the right way, and let him destroy himself with his own arrogance and bottomless ambition. And when he realized I was no longer there to endure or forgive, he'd learn. Some losses can't be bought back with any contract. 2 days after leaving the suburban safe house, I sat inside a climate-controlled box truck disguised as a medical equipment transport unit. The woman driving, Marcia, was in her 50s, with short hair and a voice like old cigarettes. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. Jason had told me ahead of time, "She's the one who'll take you somewhere no one will ever find." That place was a cedarwood cabin deep in the Appalachian woods, on private land in North Carolina. No house number, no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just rustling leaves, cold air, and the scent of burning wood from the fireplace. "Welcome to your starting point," another female voice said as I stepped inside. Her name was Avery Dean, a behavior and body language specialist who once worked in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Jason had brought her in to help me shed my skin, not just by changing my appearance, but by teaching me to live as a completely different person. Grace Donovan is an interior designer with refined taste, a standard Midwest accent, polished style, reserved but polite, Avery said, eyes fixed on me. But Nora Whitman, she's someone else. More grounded, strong but not approval-seeking. She leads with logic, not excess emotion. Understand? I nodded, but Avery immediately shook her head. No. Don't nod like that. That's Grace's reflex. Nora keeps her eyes forward, her words brief, and speaks only when needed. In the first 3 days I learned how to walk, speak, and even smile differently. Avery had me stand in front of the mirror for hours, adjusting every micro-expression, from a raised brow to how I turned my body during conversation. I dyed my hair chestnut brown with caramel highlights, a shade Richard once called cheap. I switched to light brown contact lenses, making my eyes colder and more distant. My wedding ring-wearing hands were now painted nude, clean, with no trace left behind. "Next is behavior," Avery said as we ate lunch in the simple, cozy kitchen. "You need to unlearn Grace's reactions. When someone asks, 'Where are you from?' don't hesitate like you're hiding something." Nora grew up in Milwaukee, studied at Greenfield College, worked in Charlotte and Seattle. The answer should be clear and confident. I spent every evening practicing in front of the mirror, introducing myself, repeating the fabricated memories that Jason and I had created to build Nora's background. Each story had a real location, real people who had lived there. Jason had verified it all through old civil records to ensure credibility. On day 4, a new person arrived. Dr. Renee Salazar, a behavioral psychologist. She would help with the internal transformation. "Keeping up appearances is one thing," Renee said during our first session, her voice as soft as a breeze. "But if your feelings and responses don't change, every disguise can eventually be stripped away." She asked me dozens of questions. When was the last time I felt truly happy? Why did I keep my mother's photo in my suitcase? Why did I choose the name Nora? I answered truthfully, that my mother always taught me to know when to walk away. That I chose Nora after her biological mother, who left her husband and raised a child alone in a time when no one encouraged it. And that I kept the photo not out of weakness, but to remember where I came from. Renee smiled. "Good, keep that. Memory is the foundation of a new identity." By day 6 I had begun to develop Nora's reflexes. I walked with confidence, no longer seeking eye contact for validation. I spoke concisely, no longer asking for permission to speak. I stopped reaching for my left wrist, where a wedding band used to leave a mark. I no longer softened my voice when expressing an opinion. That night Avery handed me a file, a driver's license, an employee badge from a strategic consulting firm in Portland, and the financial records of a bank account under the name Nora Whitman. "You're ready?" Avery said. "From now on, Grace Donovan is officially gone. You are Nora, and you live as her, if you truly want to survive. I held the file and something swelled in my chest, not fear, but relief. 1 month after officially becoming Nora Whitman, I was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of Portland. It wasn't luxurious or glamorous, but it was quiet enough for me to hear my own voice, the one that had been silenced for years beneath the noise of a performative marriage. Each morning I brewed my coffee, opened my encrypted laptop, and logged into the secure account Jason had set up for me. Not to check a bank balance, but to track the progress of another plan. The unraveling of Richard Donovan. I never planned on revenge. But when I found out he'd mortgaged my house, embezzled marital assets, and plotted to erase me from all financial rights, I was left with no choice but to let him destroy himself, with a little help from me. Jason was the one who triggered the emergency data package just a week after I left Georgia. The file contained all the evidence I'd collected: emails detailing financial deals between Richard and Claire, suspicious fund transfers, and most importantly, a copy of the mortgage agreement forged with my signature. There was also an audio recording of a conversation between Richard and a private banker in Palm Beach, where he bragged about restructuring the company to separate equity from spousal interference. Jason had extracted that from a VoIP call Richard didn't know was being recorded. Just a few days later, Jason got word from a friend on the Georgia Ethics Committee. Richard's former partner received the file. Investigators are moving in. That short message told me everything I needed to know. The storm had begun. 3 weeks later, a headline on a local news site flashed across my screen. Attorney Richard Donovan under investigation for financial fraud related to Donovan Strategic Holdings. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt justice. Day by day, the media got involved. Former clients began speaking out, raising questions about shady investments Richard had handled. The state bar issued a statement saying it was reviewing temporary suspensions for attorneys linked to internal complaints. Claire Monroe, the same woman who once spun beneath ballroom lights with Richard, was now appearing silently beside him in a few candid shots, no radiant smile in sight. Rumor had it she'd been terminated after Richard's firm officially severed all ties with him. Jason sent me a message with a short video clip from the preliminary hearing. In it, Richard stood in a dark suit, looking more gaunt than usual. He denied all wrongdoing, blaming internal oversights and lack of supervision from the finance team. But I knew better. Richard never did anything he couldn't control. A month later, the court officially convicted Richard Donovan on 3 counts: misappropriation of client funds, misuse of investment capital, and forgery of legal documents. The sentence: 5 years in federal prison, eligible for parole in 3 if he cooperated with the investigation. Not a single mention of Grace Donovan in the media. I had been completely erased from his life, exactly as he once wished. But this time I was the one who walked away, and the one who remained intact. I looked at the screen. In a photo accompanying the article, Richard was stepping out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. His head was down, avoiding the cameras. He was no longer the sharp-eyed man who once commanded every boardroom. He was no longer the man I once loved. I shut the laptop and stepped onto the balcony. The Portland sky on that soft autumn afternoon felt calm and forgiving. The glass in my hand no longer trembled. My breath no longer came in stutters. Because real freedom doesn't come from running away. It comes when you face the past without letting it control you. A year later, I stood by the window of my 22nd floor apartment in Brooklyn Heights, holding a steaming cup of coffee. From there I could see the Manhattan skyline in the distance, where glass towers caught the morning sun, as if the city itself was welcoming me. Quietly, but with conviction. I am Nora Whitman, 38 years old, an organizational restructuring consultant, working with companies undergoing mergers or leadership changes. The name Grace Donovan is now just an old layer of memory, tucked away in a place no one can reach. I left Portland after 6 quiet months of building a professional resume, industry connections, and a polished portfolio. Painstakingly crafted by Jason and Avery. In New York, I didn't bring memories. I brought a foundation. I wasn't here to hide, I was here to claim. My office is in an old brick building on Spring Street, where every red stone has seen victories and failures alike. I don't have a personal assistant. Every contract is an exam, every project a test. Dunbridge and Line Financial is currently my biggest client. just coming out of chaos after their former CEO was investigated for market manipulation. I was hired to restructure the culture and personnel framework. In other words, they needed someone to salvage their reputation before it vanished completely. At this morning's board meeting, I presented a mid-tier leadership overhaul plan. Not a single name in the room shook me. No piercing stare made me falter. I was no longer the woman who stood behind her husband, smiling politely when referred to as Richard Donovan's wife. I was Nora, and I spoke to be heard, not to be accepted. The meeting ended with firm nods. The chairwoman, Clarissa Hill, shook my hand, her steely gray eyes looking at me like she saw her younger self. "You make me feel young again," she said. "We need women like you, not because you're a woman, but because you have steel." I walked out of the building and into the city's tireless rhythm. A year ago I thought freedom meant leaving without being noticed. But now I knew. True freedom is living fully in the open and still being entirely yourself. That evening I attended an art exhibition by a new friend, Isabelle Tran, a Vietnamese-American visual artist with a striking lens. Her black and white photographs captured the city's old corners, where transformation happened quietly but fiercely. I saw myself in every frame, a quiet survivor of harsh transitions. I was admiring a photo titled First Steps when a familiar voice came from behind. "I didn't expect to see you here, Nora." I turned and met the eyes of Elliot Marks, interim head of HR at Dunbridge & Lyon. We'd worked together months ago on a downsizing initiative, and I assumed he was there to revisit the ripple effects of a choice we once made together. "You into art too?" I asked, keeping my tone easy. "Lately, yeah," he smiled. "Ever since I learned black and white can reveal the most colorful truths." We talked a while about photography, about work, and then about the rare stillness in a city that never sleeps. He didn't ask anything more. No probing into the past. Maybe because he saw in me something I'd spent a year reclaiming. A presence that didn't require validation from anyone else. Back at the apartment, I received an email from Jason. "Fulton House has been foreclosed, case closed." I stared at that line for a long time, then quietly deleted it. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer needed to hold on to the things that once held me back. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and finalized a new strategic proposal for a law firm looking to rebrand after a scandal. Ironically, in the very field Richard once dominated, I was now helping redefine the standard. And I didn't need to boast about it. My life now has no scars from the past, no aftershocks from a broken marriage, no shadow belonging to anyone but myself. That Friday afternoon, like clockwork, I received a message from the encrypted security system Jason built over a year ago. "Safety check confirmed, code Nightingale." A brief, clean message, but it carried the weight of a year of escape, transformation, and rebirth. I sat in the warm kitchen of my Brooklyn apartment, chamomile tea in hand, the sunset casting gold across the Manhattan Bridge through the large window. That message no longer carried the urgency it once did. Now, it was a quiet reminder. I'm still here, alive, free, and no longer anyone's possession. I opened my laptop and browsed the financial news sites I still checked every weekend, a habit that hadn't faded. One headline in the business ethics and law section made me pause. Victoria Blake steps down from Altura Capital amid financial scandal tied to Richard Donovan. I read slowly. Victoria had returned to San Diego 3 months ago after being ousted from the executive board. No more images of her at Richard's side at black tie events. No more ambitious speeches about global innovation funds. To the media, she was now just another woman who trusted the wrong man, and paid for it with her entire reputation. And Richard? He was serving time in a federal prison in Ohio, spending the next 5 years rethinking moves he once believed were clever. I read an analysis piece suggesting that if he hadn't tried to move assets so quickly, if he hadn't forged my signature on that loan contract, maybe things wouldn't have crumbled so fast. But that if was never for people who believed they were smarter than everyone else, and he, the man who once ruled an entire law firm, never saw the one thing he couldn't control coming. Me. Catherine Elliott, the woman who once smiled gently beside him in press photos, who once stepped back so he could take the stage, had completely vanished from his world. No farewell, no trace, and certainly no control left for him to hold on to. I stood up and pulled a small walnut box from the drawer. Inside, along with a few leftover personal keepsakes, was a handwritten card from my mother. The ink had faded over time, but the words still held. You can start over, as long as you don't lose yourself. Back when I was Grace, I believed I had to sacrifice pieces of myself to preserve the marriage. I thought silence was a mark of maturity. Now I understand that silence only pulled me further away from who I was. And rebirth doesn't come from running. It comes from choosing to live honestly with myself, with my memories, and with the future. That evening, Isabel and I attended the opening of a new art space on the Lower East Side. As I stepped in, I caught my reflection in a large pane of glass. Nora Whitman. Chestnut hair, bright eyes, steady gaze, squared shoulders, a smile that owed no one anything. A woman that Richard, even if he passed right by, would never recognize. We raised our glasses to celebrate the new space. Isabel tilted her head and asked softly, "Do you ever think about seeing him again, just to say something?" I smiled and shook my head. I don't need to see him. I once left in silence, but that silence was the loudest thing I've ever said. And now, I'm living the part of life he never thought I was capable of. Isabel nodded, her eyes softening, and clinked her glass against mine. Nothing more needed to be said. On the way home, I stopped by the park near my apartment, the one where I usually wrote in my journal every Sunday morning. A breeze brushed over my shoulder, and the last leaves of fall began to scatter over the bench. I opened my old leather notebook and wrote a few lines. Rebirth isn't starting over, it's continuing, stronger. After everything seemed to end, Catherine Elliott is gone, but from her ashes a woman named Nora Whitman rose. And this time, she won't step back for anyone. I closed the journal, stood up and walked away, as if I had never been anyone else. Grace's story is proof of a woman's inner strength when she chooses to let go in order to be reborn. She didn't seek revenge through loud words or dramatic acts, but through living a new life, brighter and more self-possessed than ever before. In a world where many still choose to endure in silence to protect the image of family, Grace chose to walk away and rebuild herself from the ruins. She didn't just escape the shadows of her past, she became a symbol of freedom, resilience, and the right to own her life. What do you think about Grace's choice? Could she have done things differently, or was this the only way to truly find herself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful and emotional family stories. I still remember that morning vividly. The moment when my entire world shattered. If someone had told me that a heart could break from just a few words, I would have never believed it. Until I witnessed the man I loved most walk out the door, leaving me and our newborn twins behind. I once believed that love could overcome any obstacle. That as long as we were together, nothing could tear us apart. But I was wrong. Love, it turns out, is not always strong enough to triumph over greed, ambition, and the manipulation of a woman who calls herself a mother. That was the day I realized that my children and I had never truly belonged in his world. I met Daniel on an autumn afternoon when golden leaves covered the small streets of New York. I was an interior designer, newly moved to the city in search of opportunities after graduating from college. As for him, Daniel Montgomery, he was the heir to the Montgomery & Co. real estate empire, a powerful family that owned luxury properties stretching from Manhattan to Los Angeles. But I didn't know any of that when we first met by chance at a small cafe on the side of the street. Back then, Daniel was just a charming guy with a warm smile and bright blue eyes that sparkled when he looked at me. Not a man carrying the weight of an entire dynasty on his shoulders. We fell in love quickly, the way young couples often do when they are filled with passion and hope. Daniel wasn't like other wealthy men. He never flaunted his money, never acted distant or arrogant. Instead, he was kind, gentle, and made me feel like I was the only person in his world. Those first months together were the happiest time of my life. I loved him with all my heart, never realizing that love alone wouldn't be enough to withstand the crushing weight of the Montgomery name and its legacy. When I became pregnant, Daniel was overjoyed. He held me in his arms and promised to protect me and our child forever. But love and promises were not strong enough to stand against his mother, Margaret Montgomery, a woman with piercing gray eyes and a heart of steel. I still remember the first time I met her. just a week after Daniel found out I was pregnant. She invited us to a lavish party at the Montgomery estate, where crystal chandeliers illuminated walls adorned with paintings by famous artists. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I didn't belong there. The women in their extravagant evening gowns eyed me with scrutiny. The men, mostly business associates of the family, barely acknowledged my presence as they moved through the grand room filled with power and prestige. Margaret Montgomery sat at the center of the room, a glass of red wine in her hand, her cold gray eyes scanning me from head to toe. She did not display immediate hostility, instead she wore a polite but utterly insincere smile. But I knew, from that very first moment, that she had already decided I was unworthy. "Daniel tells me you're pregnant," she said, her voice devoid of any real emotion. How unexpected. I didn't know how to respond. I tightened my grip on Daniel's hand, feeling the tension in his body. He forced a weak smile, trying to maintain a pleasant atmosphere, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Throughout the entire evening, Margaret said nothing more to me, but I knew this wasn't over. And just as I had feared, a few days later Daniel began to change. He became distant, lost in thought, frequently sleepless, and constantly receiving mysterious phone calls from his mother. When I asked, he simply reassured me that everything was fine, that I had nothing to worry about. But the unease inside me grew stronger with each passing day. By the time I gave birth to our twins, I was certain that something was wrong. Daniel was still there at the hospital, still smiling gently as he held our babies in his arms, but there was an invisible wall between us. A distance I couldn't cross. And then, on that fateful morning, I got my answer. Daniel stepped into our small apartment, his eyes hollow, his shoulders heavy as if he were carrying an entire mountain on his back. I was holding our newborns, gently rocking them to soothe their cries. When I saw him, I smiled, believing he had come to start our new life together. But that smile quickly faded when I saw the look on his face. "We need to talk," he whispered. I placed the babies in their crib and turned to him with growing concern. "What's wrong, Daniel?" He didn't answer immediately. He swallowed hard, his eyes avoiding mine. "I can't do this anymore," he finally said, his voice weak and trembling. "I just can't." My heart stopped. "Can't do what?" Daniel took a deep breath as if the words he was about to say would destroy everything. I have to leave." The air in the room turned ice cold. I could feel my heart shattering, each fragment piercing deep into my chest. "Leave?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean, Daniel?" He looked at me with tortured eyes, but there was no hesitation in his expression. He had already made up his mind. "My mother was right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We don't belong in the same world. I can't stay." Tears streamed down my face before I could stop them. I shook my head, refusing to believe what I was hearing. "You're leaving me, leaving your own children just because she told you to?" Daniel didn't respond. In that moment, I realized that the man I loved was gone. In his place stood a coward, a puppet controlled by his mother, a man willing to trade his wife and children for the security of his inheritance. Daniel turned his back on me and walked toward the door. I wanted to scream, to run to him and beg him to stay, but my body was frozen in place. "I'm sorry," he said, but he didn't dare look back. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone with our newborn twins and a shattered heart. I sat there, staring at the closed door where Daniel had just walked out. A part of me still hoped it would open again, that he would return and tell me this was all just a nightmare. But that didn't happen. In this tiny apartment, it was just me and my two newborns, completely unaware of the loss I was carrying. Tears fell silently down my face as I gazed at the two fragile lives lying in the crib. They had no idea that their father had just turned his back on them, abandoning me to raise them alone. The first days after Daniel left were the darkest of my life. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything except hold my babies close and cry. At night, the apartment felt empty and unbearably cold. The sound of their tiny cries echoed off the walls, blending with my own muffled sobs. I was completely drained, physically and emotionally. My body still ached from childbirth, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the feeling of being abandoned. I couldn't forget the moment Daniel stood there, his eyes filled with guilt but no real struggle. He had chosen the easiest way out, walking away. All the promises of love and devotion had suddenly turned into meaningless words. During those days, I felt like a different person. I let myself drown in despair, shutting out the world entirely. My phone rang countless times, friends, acquaintances, people who were worried about me, but I never picked up. I didn't know how to face them, didn't know what to say when all I had left was a broken heart and 2 babies depending on me. But then, one night as the rain tapped against the window, a truth I couldn't ignore finally settled in. I didn't have time to grieve anymore. These 2 little souls needed me. If I continued like this, who would take care of them? Who would hold them when they were sick, when they needed love and warmth? Daniel had chosen to walk away from them, but I never would. I wiped my tears, took a deep breath, and for the first time in days I told myself, I had to get up. The next day I started looking for a job, but life wasn't as easy as I had hoped. Before my pregnancy, I worked at a small interior design firm in Manhattan. However, as my due date approached, I had to take a break to prepare for the arrival of my twins. After Daniel left, I wanted to return to work, only to find that my position had been replaced. No one wanted to hire a single mother who had just given birth, someone who couldn't work late hours or maintain the flexible schedule that other employees could. I sent out countless job applications, but every single one was rejected. Some recruiters were blunt, telling me outright that I wasn't a good fit because I would have to devote too much time to my children. Others were more polite, simply stating that they needed someone who could give their full commitment. Something they didn't believe I could do. Every rejection email felt like another failure. But I couldn't give up. I had no other choice but to keep searching. There were days when I felt utterly hopeless, but whenever I looked into the clear, innocent eyes of my 2 children, I found the strength to keep going. I cut out every unnecessary expense and learned to live as frugally as possible. I couldn't afford childcare, so I had to manage everything on my own. The sleepless nights continued not because I was grieving anymore, but because my babies woke up in turns throughout the night. I learned how to change diapers with one hand while scrolling through job listings with the other. I focused on remote work, hoping to earn some income while staying home with my children. After weeks of persistence, I finally found a freelance job, doing interior design for a small company. The pay wasn't great, but at least it covered our basic needs. I worked late into the night, after my children had fallen asleep, with nothing but the glow of my computer screen illuminating the dark room. The following months were a true battle. I was a mother, an employee, and the sole provider for my family. There were days when exhaustion weighed so heavily on me that I wanted to give up, but I couldn't. I had already lost so much. I couldn't afford to lose myself too. Gradually I realized that my pain wasn't as sharp as before. It was still there, lingering like a wound that hadn't fully healed, but it no longer controlled me. I was no longer the weak woman crying in the corner of a room. I was a mother of 2, and I would not let life break me. I still didn't know what the future held, but at least I had started walking my own path, and this time I wouldn't let anyone decide my fate for me. I had grown used to long, sleepless nights. When my children finally drifted into deep sleep, I would sit in front of my computer, the pale blue light casting soft shadows on my tired face. Freelance interior design work barely covered our expenses, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I needed something bigger, something that truly belonged to me. The idea came to me one late afternoon as I was folding clothes for my twins. I realized that most children's clothing on the market looked the same, nothing special. The well-designed outfits were ridiculously expensive, while the affordable ones were poorly made. I thought to myself, why not create clothes that were both beautiful and comfortable for kids? I wasn't a fashion designer, but I had always loved creating things. When I was a child, my mother taught me how to sew tiny dresses for my dolls. She was no longer around, but those skills had stayed with me. So, I decided to give it a try. I borrowed an old sewing machine from my downstairs neighbor and started with simple pieces. Soft newborn onesies, stretchy leggings, and little dresses for baby girls. At first, I only made them for my own children, but when I posted pictures online, a few friends asked me where they could buy them. That was the moment I realized I had an opportunity. I didn't have much money to invest, but I had determination. Every spare dollar I earned went into buying fabric and supplies. I taught myself how to sew better, how to create more refined designs, and how to run an online business. It was harder than I thought. I listed my products online, but no one seemed interested. I emailed mom and baby bloggers but received no replies. Once I even got a small order, but the customer canceled at the last minute. The rejections piled up, and I started questioning if I was just wasting my time. But then, one night, as I watched my babies sleep peacefully in the outfits I had made for them, I knew I couldn't give up. I had come too far to turn back. I changed my approach. I took better, more professional photos of my products, built a small website, and started a blog, where I shared my journey as a single mother and how I was building my brand from nothing. I joined parenting groups on social media, sharing my experiences while subtly introducing my products. Slowly, little by little, the first orders began to come in. My very first customer was a young mother in Chicago. She ordered a newborn outfit for her baby girl. When I received the payment notification, I burst into tears, not because of the money, but because it was proof that I wasn't hopeless. Then came the second order, the third. Soon I started receiving messages from mothers thanking me, telling me how soft and comfortable my clothes were for their babies. Some even sent pictures of their little ones wearing my designs, their tiny faces glowing with joy. I named my brand Little Blessings because that's exactly what my twins had given me. A reason to keep going. The following months were an endless battle. I worked day and night, caring for my children, sewing clothes, packing orders, and managing my website. My small apartment had turned into a mini sewing workshop, with piles of fabric stacked everywhere and spools of thread scattered across the floor. Every morning I woke up before my children to answer customer emails. In the afternoon, while they napped, I cut fabric and sewed. At night, when everything fell silent, I stayed up learning about marketing, advertising, and brand development. I was exhausted, but I had never felt more alive. Then one day something unexpected happened. One of my posts went viral on social media. A well-known mom influencer on Instagram shared her love for Little Blessings, praising the quality and elegant design of my products. Overnight, my inbox was flooded with messages and orders skyrocketed. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had to call a friend to help me pack shipments because I couldn't keep up with the overwhelming demand. I quickly found a small local workshop to help produce my most popular designs. In just 6 months, Little Blessings had transformed from a small online shop into a well-established name in the children's fashion industry. I was no longer just working to survive. I was building a future for myself and my children. For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. One evening, as I was folding clothes to prepare for shipping, I received an email from a major mother and baby retail chain in New York. They wanted to collaborate, to bring Little Blessings into their stores. I set my phone down, my hands trembling. This was an opportunity I had never dared to dream of. I turned to look at my sleeping children, my heart swelling with gratitude. I had lost so much, but in the process, I had found myself. And I knew, this was only the beginning. I never thought I would be standing here today. From a woman abandoned and struggling in a cramped apartment with 2 infants, I was now running a thriving children's fashion brand. Little Blessings was no longer just a small online store. It had become a recognized name in mom communities, featured in articles about female entrepreneurs, and even made its way onto the shelves of major retail chains. Looking back on my journey, it still felt like a dream I once thought was impossible. But the most incredible part wasn't the success or the money I had earned. The most incredible part was that I had found myself again. I was no longer the weak woman crying behind a closed door, watching the man who abandoned her walk away. I stood up. I had built a life I could be proud of, one that was mine and mine alone. Every morning as I wake up in my more spacious apartment, watching my 2 children giggle and run around, I know I am on the right path. I no longer worry about how to afford milk for them, nor do I spend sleepless nights counting the last few coins in my wallet. Now I can provide them with a comfortable life, think about the future without the constant weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. But above all, there is one thing that matters most. I no longer resent Daniel. At first, I thought I would never be able to forgive him. He abandoned me when I was at my weakest, choosing money and power over his own family. But over time, I realized that holding on to resentment only kept me trapped in the past. Daniel no longer had a place in my life, and his existence no longer affected the path I was walking. One day, as I was reviewing my work schedule, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Amanda, it's Daniel, can we meet?" I stared at the message, a strange feeling washing over me. It had been years since I had last heard from him. After leaving me, Daniel had completely disappeared from our lives. I had no idea how he had been living, whether he was happy with his decision or not. But none of that mattered to me anymore. I put my phone down without replying. That afternoon, I sat in my small office, browsing through the latest designs for my upcoming product line. I couldn't stop my mind from drifting to the past, but this time it didn't bring me pain. I remembered the day Daniel walked out of our tiny apartment, the crushing despair that consumed me then. But I also remembered everything I had done to rebuild my life. I was no longer that woman. I was stronger, more resilient, and I no longer needed anyone else to complete me. The days that followed were busier than ever. I had an interview with a major magazine about my entrepreneurial journey, a meeting with a business partner to expand my brand, and countless orders to fulfill. Each day was another step forward in the journey I had chosen for myself. And then one day, I saw Daniel again. It was a Sunday morning when I took my children to the park. As I sat on a bench, watching them run and play, I felt a gaze from a distance. Daniel stood there, just a few meters away from me. He looked completely different from the last time I had seen him. Gone was the confident, proud man he once was. Instead, he looked exhausted, slightly older, and his eyes carried the weight of sorrow. He took a step closer, but I had no intention of standing up or showing any emotion. When he finally stopped in front of me, I simply looked up, waiting. "I wasn't sure if you'd even want to see me," Daniel said, his voice hesitant. I remained silent for a long moment before answering. "Then why are you here?" Daniel glanced at the children before turning back to me. "I saw you in the papers, saw your success, and I realized I was wrong. I wasn't surprised. I had expected this." "You realized that a little too late," I replied calmly. Daniel gave a sad smile. "I know." He looked down, his hands clenched tightly. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. Not because I expect your forgiveness, or because I want to come back, but because I truly regret what I did." I gave him a small nod. "Are you done?" He hesitated as if he hadn't expected this response from me. I looked directly at him, without anger, without sadness. "Daniel, I've come a long way to be where I am today, and none of that has anything to do with you anymore." I didn't say anything else. I simply stood up and walked toward my children, leaving Daniel standing there alone. I didn't look back, nor did I care whether he was still watching. For the first time in years, I felt light. Daniel had once been a part of my story, but he was no longer the main character. I was, and I knew that I had won. Not against him, but against the pain of my past. I walked forward, holding my children's hands, looking ahead. No looking back, no regrets. Daniel sat alone in the vast Montgomery estate, the silence almost deafening. Since leaving me and our children, he had gained everything his mother had promised him: a secure career, an immense fortune, prestige, and a place among the elite. And yet none of it had filled the emptiness inside him. Lavish parties, high-profile business meetings, and luxury vacations, all of it passed by meaninglessly. When the spotlight faded, when the praises quieted down, Daniel was left alone in the suffocating silence. No one truly cared about him. No one loved him unconditionally, the way I once did. And then, one day, everything changed. Daniel was sitting in his office when the sound of my voice echoed from the large TV screen mounted on the wall. He flinched, his head snapping up. On the screen, I was being interviewed on a morning talk show, sitting across from a well-known host. "Your story is truly an inspiration to so many women out there," the host said with a warm smile. "From being a single mother abandoned by her husband to now building a successful children's fashion brand. Can you share a little about your journey?" I smiled softly, my gaze calm and full of confidence. A version of me Daniel had never seen before. "At first I didn't think I could do it," I said. "But I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. I had 2 children who needed me, and I couldn't let the past hold me back forever." On the screen, images of me and my children appeared. We were playing in a park, laughing, dressed in outfits I had designed myself. The host continued, "Your brand, Little Blessings, has made a huge impact in the children's fashion industry. What has been the most important lesson for you in this journey?" I smiled again. "The most important thing was learning to believe in myself. I am no longer the woman I used to be. No longer afraid, no longer dependent on anyone. I built my happiness on my own. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his eyes remained glued to the screen as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I had completely transformed. I was no longer the fragile woman he had abandoned. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The final image before the segment ended showed me holding my 2 children, all 3 of us smiling radiantly. Daniel turned off the TV, but the images didn't leave his mind. He suddenly realized he had been wrong. So devastatingly, irreversibly wrong. For years he had tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, that leaving me was the best decision. But now, seeing me happy and strong without him, he finally understood that he had lost the most precious thing in his life. He couldn't bear the thought that I had truly moved on without him. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the estate. He had no idea what he would say, no idea if I would even want to see him, but he couldn't continue living with this regret any longer. By the time he arrived at my apartment, the sky had darkened. Everything was different from the day he left. Back then I lived in a small, cramped apartment, but now I had moved into a spacious, elegant home. Modern yet warm. Daniel stood at the door, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how I would react, but he knew he had to try. He rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened. I stood there, still me, yet no longer the same. I was stronger, more confident, and my eyes no longer carried any trace of sorrow when I looked at him. Daniel opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. I crossed my arms, my voice calm. "What are you doing here?" Daniel swallowed hard. I saw you on TV." I remained silent, waiting. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. "I was wrong, Amanda. I was wrong from the beginning. I should never have left you. I let my mother control my life and I lost everything." I tilted my head slightly, my expression unreadable. "And now you realize that?" Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I know it's too late, but I need you to know that I truly regret it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect another chance. I need you to know that you were the only person I ever loved." I looked at him for a long moment before replying softly, "Daniel, I don't need that." He froze. "What?" I smiled, but it wasn't a soft smile. It was a smile of liberation. "I don't need to know whether you loved me or not. I've moved on. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and you are no longer a part of it." Daniel stood frozen, as if he had finally come to terms with the truth. I continued, "You chose your path a long time ago, and so did I. Now I'm happy, and I don't need a painful past coming back to disrupt my life." Daniel lowered his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. He knew he couldn't change the past. I took a deep breath and spoke softly. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." Then I closed the door. Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door in front of him. A light breeze passed by, carrying a deep sense of loss with it. He had everything, then lost it all. And this time he knew there was no getting it back. Daniel remained standing outside, motionless before the door that had just shut in his face. A part of him wanted to knock again, to beg for a chance, but deep down he knew it was pointless. I was no longer the woman I once was, the woman who had pleaded through tears for him to stay. I had moved on. I had built a life without him, and Daniel was finally forced to face the reality that he had lost everything. He turned away, his steps heavy as he walked out of the apartment complex. A sharp gust of cold wind slipped through his coat, but he didn't even notice. His mind was empty, except for the echo of my words ringing in his head. "You are no longer a part of my life." Those words cut through him like a knife, but there was no one to blame but himself. By the time he returned to the Montgomery estate, the grand mansion loomed against the night, its golden light spilling through the towering windows. It was still as magnificent as ever, still a symbol of power and status. The very things he had chosen over his own family. But tonight all Daniel could see was how empty and lifeless it felt. He stepped into the vast foyer, where the scent of oak wood and his mother's expensive perfume lingered in the air. Everything was perfect. The intricate Persian rugs, the oil paintings on the walls, the carefully placed luxury furniture. But there was no warmth in any of it. Margaret Montgomery sat in her usual armchair, swirling a glass of red wine in her hand. When she saw her son walk in, she didn't look surprised. "Where have you been?" Her voice was as cold as ever. Daniel didn't answer right away. He shrugged off his coat, placed it over a chair, and walked to the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "I went to see Amanda," he finally said, his voice hoarse. Silence filled the room for a few moments. Margaret set down her wineglass and let out a long, unimpressed sigh. "I suppose you've realized that you no longer have a place in her life." Daniel turned to her, his gaze dark. "You knew?" She smirked. "Did you really think a woman you abandoned would sit around waiting for you forever?" Her words made Daniel tighten his grip around the glass. "You say that as if this wasn't your fault." Margaret let out a small chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. "My fault?" "Daniel, I simply guided you toward the path you were born to walk. You are a Montgomery heir, not some ordinary man with a small, forgettable family. I gave you everything." Daniel scoffed bitterly. "Everything? You really think I have everything?" He slammed his glass down on the table, the liquid spilling across the polished wood. "I have money. I have a career. I have power. But do you know what else I have? Emptiness. Every morning I wake up in this mansion and walk into an office full of people who don't respect me for who I am. They respect me because I'm a Montgomery. I'm surrounded by people, yet I've never felt more alone." Margaret said nothing, her expression unreadable as she watched her son. Daniel continued, his voice unsteady. "Meanwhile, Amanda moved on. She succeeded without me. Our children grew up without me. And He let out a bitter laugh. "All I have left is this place, you, and everything you call everything." Margaret tilted her head, folding her arms across her chest. "So, what do you want, Daniel? Do you expect me to apologize for helping you secure your future?" Daniel laughed, but there was nothing but bitterness in it. "No, Mother, you never apologize. You never regret anything you do." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "But I do." He looked straight at his mother, the once bright blue eyes now clouded with exhaustion. "I regret listening to you. I regret losing Amanda. I regret not being there when my children took their first breaths. But most of all, I regret letting you control my life for so many years." Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly, for the first time appearing unsettled by her son's words. Daniel took a deep breath, as if gathering the last of his courage to say what he needed to say. "I'm leaving." Margaret sat up abruptly. "What did you just say?" Daniel glanced around the mansion one last time, his gaze sweeping over the paintings, the luxurious furniture, the expensive decor he once thought he couldn't live without. But now, all of it felt like an empty shell. "I'm leaving," he repeated slowly and clearly. "I can't keep living like this. I don't know where I'll go, I don't know what I'll do, but I can't stay here." Marguerite stood up, her usual composed tone cracking. "You're acting like a fool, Daniel. Do you really think you can walk away from everything? If you step out of that door, you will lose your inheritance, lose everything I have built for you." Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a man who had reached his breaking point. "You're right. If I leave, I'll lose everything. But you know what? I lost the most important things a long time ago." He turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the mansion. This time, no one ran after him, no one stood at the door to stop him. Only a solitary figure walked away from the extravagant world he once thought he couldn't live without. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt truly free. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, filling my spacious yet cozy home with warmth. The sound of my children's laughter echoed through the air, blending with the soft aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I sat at my desk, fingers gliding over the keyboard, reviewing the latest contracts for Little Blessings, the brand I had built from nothing. I had come a long way to be here today. From a struggling single mother abandoned at her weakest, I had become a successful entrepreneur, featured in business magazines celebrating women in startups. Little Blessings was no longer just a small online store selling baby clothes. It had grown into a nationally recognized brand, with its products displayed in major retail chains across the U.S. I had even opened 2 flagship stores in New York and Los Angeles, where young mothers came to find beautifully designed clothing for their children. Every day I was busier than ever, yet I never felt tired. Everything I had today was built by my own hands. No one handed it to me. I didn't rely on anyone. And most importantly, I no longer needed Daniel's validation. The day he walked away from the Montgomery estate, leaving behind the luxury he had once fought so hard to protect, I didn't even know. It wasn't until much later that I heard he had given up his inheritance, cut ties with his mother, and started over from nothing. But that no longer mattered to me. I no longer thought of him with resentment, nor did I care about what he was doing or how he felt. He was a part of my past, but that past no longer held any power over me. That afternoon, I took my children to the park. They ran across the lush green grass, their laughter filling the air. I sat on a bench, sipping my coffee, savoring the peace I had fought so hard to achieve. A woman sat down beside me, offering a warm smile. "You're Amanda, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "The founder of Little Blessings?" I nodded, smiling back. "Oh my God, I'm such a huge fan of yours," she exclaimed. "I've been following your journey for so long. Your story is truly inspiring. You've done what so many women dream of, rising from pain, rebuilding your life, and achieving incredible success." Her words took me by surprise, but a warmth spread through my heart. "I just did what I had to do," I replied. "I refused to let my circumstances define my future." The woman nodded, smiling. "Thank you for sharing your story. You've given strength to so many people." I watched as she walked away, my heart full of emotion. I had never thought my story could inspire others, but now I realized that what I had built wasn't just about providing for my children or making a living. I had become a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to be defined by her past. That evening I sat on the living room couch, my 2 children curled up in my arms. I told them a bedtime story. Not one about princes or princesses, but about a woman who stood up, overcame hardships, and created her own happiness. "Sue, did she end up happy, Mommy?" my little girl asked, her round eyes looking up at me. I smiled, kissing her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. She created her own happiness." As I turned off the lights and stepped out of the room, I paused at the doorway, watching my children sleep peacefully. They were all I needed. I didn't need a man to complete me. I didn't need someone to come and save me. I had saved myself. My life, my happiness, my future, all of it was built by my own hands. And for the first time in years, I knew I was truly in control of my destiny. Life doesn't always go the way we expect, but how we face adversity defines who we become. From being abandoned and hitting rock bottom, Amanda rebuilt herself. Refusing to let the past control her future, she didn't need saving, nor did she need validation from the man who once left her behind. Her success, happiness, and freedom were all her own doing. This story isn't about revenge or regret. It's about growth, resilience, and reclaiming one's life. It stands as proof of the strength and determination of a woman in the face of adversity. What do you think about Amanda's journey? Do you agree with her decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow the channel for more inspiring stories about life and family.